America is Born, written by Gerald W. Johnson and illustrated by Leonard Everett Fisher. A letter to Peter Van den Hornet, for whom this book was written. Dear Peter, you were born in the state of Massachusetts, and that makes you a citizen both of the United States and the state of Massachusetts. The law says so, and since the law was written many years before you were born, you had nothing to do with it. Just being born here made you a citizen of the United States, and nobody can deny it. But the law did not make you an American. Many people think it did, but they are wrong. That part of the law does not even mention the word American. Citizens of the United States are, in fact, called Americans, but many other people live in America too. Canadians and Mexicans, for example, have as much right to be called Americans as you and I. The United States grew so fast and became so strong that people in Europe fell into the habit of forgetting the people in other countries of America when they spoke of Americans. So, you see, being an American is not exactly the same as being a citizen. It is that, but it is something more. The law can make you a citizen, and people will call you an American because you are a citizen of the United States. Citizens of the United States have done things that other people have remembered. It isn't the law that makes you an American. It is the fact that you are connected with the things done in America that nobody forgets. This book tells of some of those things and tries to explain how they all fit together to make a story that has a beginning and a middle, but no end as yet, because it is still going on. You yourself, Peter, are part of that story. And by the time you have a grandson, you will have added something to it that you can tell him, but that I cannot tell you because it hasn't happened yet. That is what being an American means, being part of a continued story that goes back from you to George Washington, and beyond him to Captain John Smith, and beyond John Smith to Christopher Columbus. Part of the story is very fine, and other parts are very bad, but they all belong to it, and if you leave out the bad parts, you will never understand it all. Yet you must understand it if you are to make your part one of the fine parts, which is what every father and mother and grandparent hope and expect of a boy. G.W.J., Baltimore, 1958. America is Born. Chapter 1, The Unknown Land. There are a couple things in this chapter that you will hear. One is the talk about civilization, and I want to read to you what that definition is. A civilization is a relatively high level of cultural and technological development, or it can mean the culture that is characteristic of a particular time or a place. The other thing you will hear in this section is the discussion about a fleur de lis, which is an image that I will show you, and the way that they discuss it is how it is held on a compass rose. This is a picture of a compass rose from a 1753 Dutch compass, and at the very top here is a representation of the fleur de lis. It is an image that you will see in many places if you start to notice it. 500 years ago, the land that is now the United States had not a single city, nor even a brick house, not a paved road, not a factory, not a plowed field. Of course, there were no railroads or automobiles or airplanes, for those things had not been invented. But in other parts of the world, there were plenty of cities and roads and fields. There were canals with barges on them, and rivers with great ships. There were workshops where skillful men made beautiful and useful things. There were books and pictures, fine clothes, fine horses, and carriages, most of the things that people needed to live in comfort. But that was in the Eastern Hemisphere. If you take a globe of the world and you draw a line from the North Pole to the South, from the North Pole down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean to the South Pole, and then up through the middle of the Pacific back to the North Pole, that part of the globe that contains Europe, Asia, and Africa is the Eastern Hemisphere, and there lived the people who had discovered or invented most of the things that we use every day. In our half of the world, which we call the Western Hemisphere, there was no civilization 500 years ago except in Mexico and Peru, where people built cities with houses of stone and knew how to carve statues and paint pictures. They had a kind of writing very different from ours, but still writing. They knew arithmetic and geometry, and they had engineers who built large and wonderful temples and palaces for their kings. But in what is now the United States, there were no people except those we call Indians. They were savages with dark skins, not black, but copper-colored, and there were not many of them for so large a stretch of land. Here and there the Indians had cleared away the forest from some small spots, but in general the land was covered with great trees. They came down almost to the water's edge on the Atlantic coast, and they stretched back over a flat plain, in some places narrow, but in others extending for hundreds of miles until the hills began. Trees covered the hills, too, for many miles until the hills rose into the mountains. These mountains were not one single range, but many ranges, most of them running side by side, but some crisscrossing. We call the whole system by an Indian name, the Appalachians, and the different ranges by other names, such as the Blue Ridge, the Alleghanies, the Great Smokies, and others. The Appalachians are fairly high mountains, rising to more than 6,000 feet in what is now New Hampshire, and nearly 7,000 feet in North Carolina, but they are not so high that trees cannot grow even on their tops. The forest kept on across the mountains and down into the valley on the western side. There the land sloped gradually for hundreds of miles to a great river in the middle of the continent, a river so huge that the Indians called it the Mississippi, which in their language meant the father of waters. On the western side of the Mississippi, the land sloped up again, but the slope was so gradual that you would hardly notice it and might think that the country was quite flat. Still, it was slowly rising, and some hundreds of miles west of the Mississippi, it broke into another mountain system, and this time a huge one. People, especially in the East, have the habit of calling them the Rocky Mountains, but the fact is that the Rockies are only a small part of the whole system. The mountains go on, range after range, almost to the Pacific Ocean, and in places they are so high that no trees can grow. On their highest peaks, which in California rise to nearly 15,000 feet. That is almost 3 miles up, and it is so cold and windy up there that nothing can grow. The peaks are bare rock. The rock is almost straight up and down. But where it is fairly level, the snow lies and doesn't melt all summer. At the far western edge of the continent, the last mountain range slopes down steeply to hills that are lower and lower until one comes to the coast of the Pacific Ocean. This is the shape of the United States as one goes from east to west, up from the Atlantic to the Appalachians, down to the Mississippi River, up again to the Rockies, and down again to the Pacific. It is very large, almost 3,000 miles from east to west, and almost 16,000 miles from north to south, and parts of it are so different from one another that they do not seem to be part of the same country. For example, some hundreds of miles west of the Mississippi River, the forest stopped because the soil and the rainfall were not right for growing trees, but grass grew there, and in places was so high that a man on horseback could barely see above it. If you looked at him from a little distance, you could not see his horse at all. As the land grew higher, the grass grew shorter until on what we call the high plains close to the Rocky Mountains, and about 4,000 feet high, all that was left was buffalo grass growing close to the ground. It got its name because it was fine food for the wild animals that the first settlers called buffalo. Actually, they were bison, and later for cattle. Then in certain places, especially in the Southwest, there was so little water that even the buffalo grass could not grow, and the land was sandy or stony desert with nothing growing except a few desert plants such as cactus, mesquite, and sagebrush. 500 years ago, all this was unknown to anyone in the Eastern Hemisphere. In Europe, men didn't even know that America existed. They knew, or at least educated people knew, that the world was round, but they supposed that water extended from the coast of Spain to the coast of China, with no land except perhaps some islands in between. They all thought that the water was so wide that nobody could get across it. This was not as silly as it seems to us today. There were no steamships and no very large sailing ships. Many of the ships they had were moved by oars, not by sails. To go out to the sea in such a craft was dangerous, and only a few ships were large enough to carry water and food for a long voyage. Then there was the difficulty of finding one's way. When you are out of sight of land, the sea looks the same in all directions. Of course, the sun rises in the east and it sets in the west, so if you could see which way the sun was moving, you knew which way your ship was going. At night, you could steer by the North Star, which in the old days was called Polaris because it was almost over the North Pole. As long as your ship pointed toward the North Star, you knew that to your right was east, to your left west, and at your back was south. But suppose the sky was cloudy and the air foggy, as it often is at sea for many days together. You could see neither sun nor stars. What then? Sailors had solved that problem by what they called the compass. They had discovered that certain chunks of iron ore, which they called lodestones, were natural magnets, and if you took a steel needle and you rubbed it on a lodestone, the needle, if free to move, would turn until it pointed almost north and south. To make it free to move, they fastened the needle to something light, such as a bit of cork, and they let it float in a bowl of water. They used a round bowl which they fastened firmly on the ship at a place where the man steering could see it, and on its rim they cut notches or made marks, dividing it into 360 equal parts to represent the 360 degrees of a circle. One notch was in line with the prow of the ship, and counting from that, notch number 90 pointed to the right, number 180 pointed toward the stern. As the ship turned, the rim of the bowl turned with it, but the floating needle did not. So the steersman knew that if the needle pointed to notch 0, the ship was going north, while if it pointed to notch 90, the direction was west, and if it pointed to 180, it was south. On a modern compass, north is marked not by the 0, but by a fleur-de-lis. Now, the reason is that the Italians who developed the mariner's compass found that in Italy, the needle always pointed toward the Alps, north of Italy. They guessed that it was pointing at something beyond the mountains, the Italian word for which was tramontane. So they marked that point with a T instead of a 0. Later, compass makers began to make the T fancier and fancier until finally they turned it into the fleur-de-lis, which looks something like a very fancy T. Yet even with the compass, sailing out of sight of land was pretty risky business, for while you could always tell which way you were going, you had no good way of telling how far you had gone. You could make a rough guess by judging the speed of the ship through the water and multiplying it by the number of hours that you had been sailing, but that was only a very rough guess, and men didn't like to risk their lives on it. So for the most part, the ships in those days kept pretty close to shore, where the pilot could see some kind of landmark, high hill perhaps, or when close to shore, a church steeple or a very tall tree, which would tell him where he was. Even so, some daring sailors had gone a long way out. They had discovered Iceland in the north and the Canary and Cape Verde Islands in the south. Some had even pushed down the whole length of Africa to the Cape of Good Hope. But of America, they knew nothing at all, and for a long time, nobody really cared to know. I'm going to pause there because we have been talking for 14 minutes, and we will resume at this point next time on page 20.